welcome to episode 27 of the Hard Truth About B2B e-commerce. I'm your host, Isaiah Bollinger from
Hi.
Trellis.
Yes, and I'm John Cymerman, CTO of Trellis. So I've worked with Isaiah since 2016. So it's already been like 4 years, man.
I know. So normally our co-host is Tim, but John is filling in, and we'll call him a co-host / guest today. So John, we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of integrations that I think is going to be a little more detailed than we've ever been in the past. But before I get into that, I have to mention our sponsor, Punch Out To Go. We're grateful for our sponsor. They jumped on early, which I think was smart, before we really had a lot of traction, and I think they're reaping the results of that. And Punch Out To Go is a global B2B integration company specializing in connecting commerce business platforms such as a Magento or Shopify or BigCommerce with e-procurement and ERP applications. And Punch Out To Go's iPaaS technology seamlessly links business applications to automate the flow of purchasing data. So with their solution, you can immediately reduce integration complexities for things like punch out catalogs, electronic purchase orders, invoices, and other B2B sales order automation documents. So they can really help you accelerate business results through automation. They can help you kind of integrate with your customers, which is a common need that the B2B space is finding in terms of, customers are asking for this kind of solution. So if you're looking to automate and improve your processes, I would certainly go talk to Punch Out To Go. At the very least, they're good people, and they can just at least give you some honest feedback about their solution and if it's the right solution for you. So yeah,
Yep.
John. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, allowing vendors to place purchase orders with you from the comfort of their own ERP. I mean, that is just, time savings right there. So I definitely think Punch Out solution is one of the first tools that B2B companies should be going to if they've got vendors that want to place orders, which most B2B companies do. Then a Punch Out solution is great. And Punch Out To Go is one of the best out there. So.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree. I think that was one of the first big B2B projects that we worked with you at Trellis that they ended up using that solution. So yeah, John, a lot of people don't know you at Trellis in the sense that, obviously me and Jared are kind of the salespeople out there.
Yeah, the face
LinkedIn.
of the company. I'm the nerd in the back office working on crazy plans to take over the world while you guys, distract everyone else. So,
for people that don't know you, can you kind of introduce yourself? Obviously, you're the CTO at Trellis, one of the owners,
Yep.
or core owners, but maybe tell us a little bit about your background even before Trellis.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I've been working on web technology stuff that's PHP based since around 2005. So around 16 years of experience working on websites. And I've been doing e-commerce related things since around 2008. Basically, figuring out how to best position products online, build websites that are scalable, while being easy to maintain. Magento, came into the picture for me around 2014 when I started with working with a company based out of New York City called Pixify. And since that time, I've been focused on building those websites as well as integrating those sites with back office systems, other platforms, so that it's not just the website that the customer is going to, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes that make that experience good for the user while also simplifying operations on the backside of things for the company. Worked with a large gamut of technologies, some of which we'll be talking about today, and focusing on, scalability, ease of use, and reducing friction on the inside of the companies. So.
I think at your days before Trellis, you guys you got some experience in B2B e-commerce, correct? With I think you guys had a pretty big B2B company, Noble Biocare. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, Noble Biocare. So they're very big in the sort of medical products space. That was a fairly large, high budget project with a lot of interworking parts. But their typical, user was like a hospital or small doctor's offices,
Yep.
buying their products online that they need to keep running their business. So, that was a fairly large one, significant SOAP API integration. So, that's a really good example. But at Trellis here, we've seen a really big trend now in B2B companies wanting to have a strong online presence, easy customer experience for people that are repeat customers, come back and place orders quickly. So we're seeing a very big spike in interest in that stuff. So that's become a major focus of our company over, I would say, the past 2 to 3 years.
Absolutely. And I think those projects also end up being a lot more complicated than the B2C projects on average. Obviously,
For sure.
and so they often require.
We'll talk about a lot of reasons for that, but yes, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, which ends up
being complex.
Yeah, having you being more involved because they're more complex. So let's start there. That was kind of our goal. Let's start high level, and we're going to work our way down into the very nitty gritty details. So if you want to learn the details of, in my opinion, one of the best integration minds in B2B e-commerce, stay tuned. Listen through the whole thing. Don't cut out after we just go through the high level. So with B2B, it's definitely different than B2C, and I think a lot of people kind of underestimate that. B2B company comes to a company like Trellis or another agency, and they're like, we want an e-commerce site. Oh, like it'll be easy. Everyone does it. You go get Shopify, and you see these people get up and running with e-commerce fast, but that's because it's mostly B2C stuff that's easy. With B2B, there's things like, larger order volume or larger average order value. I think we actually had a conversation with BigCommerce, and they're saying there was customers that they were running into issues when they tried to place an order with over 200 items in the cart, which can happen with B2B. Because in B2B, you might have I'm doing a construction job, and I have, 1,000 parts I need to order for this construction job, right? So
right.
There are all these things. So, can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what you've seen from a B2B perspective and why it's so different from just a pure basic e-commerce standpoint?
Yeah, sure. So, we can talk about sort of the different approach that these companies are taking towards, business success and how they're running their businesses. So, typically when you have a B2C company, kind of a retail company selling to end users, typically these transactions are, first of all, they're going to be usually lower dollar amounts. These are typically going to be in the tens to hundreds to thousands, single digit thousands types of orders at the max. So these are smaller dollar value orders. They're also going to be a larger order volume, just because you're selling to a wide audience. A lot of times, think of like a shop that you would find in the mall or something. This is kind of like the basis for your typical B2C company. You have foot traffic, people coming in, spending maybe 15, 30, 45 minutes in your store, buying a few things, and then walking out the door. So online experience is very similar to that, where it's kind of a window shopping experience. Yeah. You may never see that customer again. They may become a loyal customer and maybe buy a few things from you every year. But most of the time, you're not expecting to make the majority of your income off of a handful of customers. Usually, you're talking about hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of customers making up your revenue. So that's one thing that's a bit different. Another thing, typically with B2B, B2C online stores, you may have one warehouse, two warehouses, right, that you're fulfilling all your orders in the U.S. from. You're leveraging the shipping companies, FedEx, UPS, et cetera, to achieve distribution, and you're not necessarily having to always rely on a wide warehouse distribution network. That can be different depending on the size of the retail company you're talking about, but when you're talking about small to mid-sized retailers, you're usually talking about a small number of warehouses. Yeah. So that's another thing.
Or they might even just have one fulfillment center outsourced.
Yeah. Whereas, with B2B companies, you're usually talking about, you can be talking about a distributor, which has a wide warehouse network across the entire country. Maybe they have one per geographical region. So maybe you're talking, 6, 9, 12 warehouses or more,
Some we've
depending
seen
on the
in the
size of
50,
the B2B company you're talking about, right?
yeah, we've seen some that are like one per state. So like 50.
Right. So yeah, so that's a very that's a much bigger logistical problem to solve, right? So that tends to be a focus of those companies is
Where does the order get routed? It's not as simple as like,
right. You want to ensure delivery times of 2 to 3 days, right? Maybe you have your own trucks that you're shipping orders on. Maybe
yeah,
you're trying to ensure that the truck distance being driven is not a long distance, right? So you've got these sort of like logistical problems that you need to focus on as a company to solve, rather than being as slim and lean as possible with your warehouse and distribution network, right? So
yeah, yeah.
um,
I think that that's what people don't realize is a lot of the value of B2B companies is they have their own logistical network and then they have to translate that online. It's a lot more
right,
complicated than you think because it's not like, oh, just integrate with FedEx rates. You have to like, maybe you do have some FedEx, but you have potentially they ship from your own warehouses and you have all these, rules and operations behind this that are not so easy to just display on a website, right?
right, exactly. And then, another angle you have to be thinking about when it comes to B2B companies is the amount that they depend on their individual customers. A lot of these companies, they have, maybe they have a lot of customers, but the majority of their income is coming from maybe a half dozen to, 20 to 30 companies. So the value of retaining these individual customer relationships is paramount in these companies, because if they lose a big vendor and maybe they're a distributor for some nationwide brand, think like Walmart or Staples, or maybe they're a vendor for one of these types of companies, and the value of those accounts can be in the tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars, even millions.
Millions.
Yeah, so the cost of keeping up that relationship, it can be higher, right? Because you can dedicate a salesperson just for managing one or two of these big accounts, right? So you can afford an entire person's salary based on the margin you're making on an individual customer. So sort of the focus has been traditionally on the investment in these bigger, longer term relationships. Some of these B2B relationships can go into multiple generations of ownership. You have like a family owned B2B business.
Yeah.
This is a customer that goes back to like the 1970s, 1950s, right? And
Yeah.
so, the investment in that relationship can be higher because the expected value of retaining that relationship is high. Whereas, you imagine an individual retail customer, even one of your most loyal retail customers, maybe only makes you thousands of dollars per year, right? So
Yeah.
having a human involved in maintaining that relationship doesn't make a lot of sense,
Yeah.
right?
It's
So
pretty rare that you want to have a lot of human intervention in a B2C relationship.
right,
It might happen in some kind of high-end curated products, but generally it's more an automated process, self
right.
like now that's every, even when I go to Target, like there's like one person there, it's like all self-checkout, because it's just, why not?
Right, exactly. Yeah, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So you have sort of the tradition of the salesperson in the B2B company space, whereas in B2C, the individual salespeople aren't quite as important to the business and haven't traditionally been as quite as important, right? So,
Yeah.
so all these differences are adding up to sort of a very different solution space between B2B and B2C. It adds up to the fact that B2C wants to adopt technology quicker because there's more yield and benefit from more automation, right? The
Yeah.
more there's more of a compelling payoff of starting to remove more humans from the process and making it easier, making a lower barrier to entry per customer, because you need a larger volume of customers coming through the door to keep your business profitable, right? So you want to be able to reach a wide audience. You want to have a quick customer experience, and you want to focus less on sort of the human connection with these customers because the individual value per customer is lower there.
Yeah.
By comparison with B2B, the need to get online isn't quite as compelling because it's okay for people to be calling a call center or for salespeople to be reaching out individually to these folks because of that individual dollar value per customer being higher, right? So it doesn't need to be as fast of a process. It doesn't need to be as low human cost of a process. It's okay for that to be, the cost to be higher there because you have a smaller volume of customers placing these orders. So
Yeah. But I would actually argue that just to touch in there, I would
yep.
argue that culture and that kind of I'm trying to think of the right word here.
That mindset, it's
that
changing.
mindset is changing, and I think
It is
that's a dangerous mindset to continue to have. And because companies
yes.
we're a good example. We buy a lot of B2B stuff. We're a B2B company, right? But we buy almost everything online. We buy Apple online. We have a B2B
Right.
account.
Absolutely.
And if someone told me, hey, we need to call you to order something, probably not going to do it. We're going to be like, hey, we need an online portal to.
Right. The mindset's changing. I was talking here about historical, but that is changing. And a large reason for that, we are like sort of the, Isaiah, you and I are kind of like, we're sort of the computer and smartphone generation, maybe folks younger than us as well. They would consider themselves to be kind of the smartphone generation, right? Doing things online. 1996 was the dawn of the internet, and more the business leaders of today are people that had the internet as part of their growing up experience, right? And so people who buy a lot of their stuff on Amazon, in the B2B buying experience, you start to expect it to be kind of similar to your experience buying things on Amazon. You want to be able to just not deal with a human, just be able to go on, browse at your leisure, place orders without sort of this high level of upkeep being necessary. That's becoming more and more of an expectation. So, despite the historical adoption of new technologies maybe being a little bit lower on the B2B side of things, that is changing, right? So, so I think that's certainly true.
I mean, we have a business Amazon account. Our account is business, and we buy a lot on Amazon through the business account.
Right.
Those are all B2B orders that we're placing on Amazon, and they're definitely getting smarter and better at recommending things to us and trying to get us to buy, because they realize, hey, these guys, they probably see how much we order every year, and it's probably going up a little bit every year. So,
Right. Yeah. And so that trend is accelerating, and more companies are seeing that sort of that spike in B2B interest in having a smart and robust online experience that's still supported by a lot of the complex back office systems that they're used to, but they're making that buying experience quicker and easier because people are just beginning to expect it. It's just becoming part of the culture and part of the sort of the commerce reality of businesses today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to move on, but I want to touch on a couple things before we move on.
Sure.
You pretty much hit on everything, except one of the big things that I think is a problem. And the reason I call this the hard truth about B2B commerce is because it's hard, right? Like, these projects are harder. It's not just the technology, it's also the culture.
Mm-hmm.
These salespeople have to kind of transition. If you move everything online, their role needs to shift. So how do you envision the salesperson evolving or changing? What would you recommend? And I know you're not you do some sales, but you're not the salesperson at sales per se. But what would you recommend for a company that's going online, and how should they handle their sales force or transition them to a new website?
Yeah. So I think traditionally, there's been a high degree of focus of making unique deals per customer. There's sort of there's this understanding that if I make an exception here and I make an exception there for these customers, that they're more likely to sign with us. And that's sort of the upkeep on that is more valuable because of, like I said, the higher dollar value per customer being there. So when you translate that to online, though, the more stipulations and the more exceptions that you allow, the upkeep and the maintenance overhead on a code base, before this is more of a manual process, but to make things more automatic, the more exceptions that you throw in, sort of the software development overhead and costs there will start to spike up. So I think one important thing about the mindset should be a focus on streamlining and eliminating some exceptions and making more of a rules-based system. Maybe instead of having 150 different customers with different unique approaches to discounting and
Pricing.
their pricing, the catalog that they can view, all these things, streamlining that to maybe like a half dozen to a dozen different rule sets has a lot of payoff and value when it comes to the technology overhead that you're going to be expecting to have.
Or maybe like some sort of algorithm or rule, like, you
Sorry.
spend X, you get this price.
Sorry, I got a notification from my laptop about battery. I thought
Oh,
it was
no
plugged
worries.
in. Yeah, sorry.
So to kind of touch on that, you could potentially even build kind of like one kind of like scalable algorithm. And actually, this was a guest that we had that that had kind of done this. They basically built like an algorithm, like a pricing algorithm that was like almost like one scalable rule that could apply to all customers based on how much they buy and certain parameters. And I think that's a lot more efficient than, like you said, manually having different pricing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, making it some kind of rules-based system with, if this, then they get that, and then, if this other case, then they get this other level of pricing. Making it more of a uniform system rather than, oh, well, it's almost uniform except this like handful of different customers with really custom pricing rules. Trying to simplify a bit of that while not, of course, disrupting your customer relationships is a very smart move when you're trying to automate more.
Yeah, I agree.
Another thing is sort of like removing customer concern about logistics. I think historically, there's been a bit more transparency in terms of, we have this many in stock in this warehouse, and then if you buy this now, you may get it by this date, but then this other part of the order will come at a different time. And so there's been traditionally like a lot of communication over sort of the nuances of the logistical back end of the things that are going on to fulfill orders, that when you go to online, you don't necessarily want to transmit all of that. It makes for a bit more of a sort of difficult to understand, or a lot of steps to the process of like picking what I want to buy and then like maybe picking the warehouse that I want the order fulfilled from.
Yeah,
right? So,
it's funny that you're saying this because one of our previous guests, maybe just two, I forget, it was very recent. He works at a large B2B company, and his one of his main things that he said is like a lot of B2B companies think that their customers want to know or should know all the things that are going behind the scenes, but they don't care. They just want to get the product and get it quickly and have a good process, and so they don't need to know all the weird logistical things. Like, hide that, let that go behind the scenes, and focus on the good user experience that makes it easy for them to just buy.
Yeah, exactly. One thing I try to stress is it's okay to have a bit of follow-up after the order is placed, but you want to make the cost of coming to the website, going through to checkout and placing the order with you, you still want that to be a low-cost experience. You still want to focus on the user being able to come into your site and having a low number of steps and a low number of clicks, a low number of barriers between them coming to your site and going to the order phase. Yeah. So yeah, taking some of those things that are maybe a bit logistically intensive and putting that on the back end of the transaction, let them place the order. And then if you want to have a salesperson reach out and explain, okay, this part of the order will come from our own truck, whereas this part of the order will be shipped FedEx to you at a later point. Having some additional follow-up on the back end is okay, as long as the initial process of getting them to place the order is one that's low barrier. So, bringing some of these sort of like B2C mentalities into the B2B buying experience, I think has a lot of value for companies, and something that during the sales and discovery process, it's something that I really try to stress.
Yeah, I agree. So just last thing before we move on. So let's say you've accomplished all these things and you did a good job with that. What do you think the role of the salesperson should be at this point? Because now, a lot of the orders are going online. They're not maybe taking as many orders over the phone. Do you think it's a lot more follow-up? Like you mentioned, it's okay.
Yeah, I think, the salesperson, in order to adapt to this new sort of technology landscape, I think the role of the salesperson in a B2B setting should start to transition to more of like an account management type of role,
Yeah,
where you're still getting referrals from people placing these orders, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to sort of maybe broaden the amount of your catalog that company's looking at, right? Maybe maybe you're a distribution company for doors, and they look a lot at the door products you have. Maybe they don't look at a lot at some of the other security alarm systems, right? So like, here's an example of where a salesperson could kind of drive these customers to start looking at a broader section of your catalog.
basically
Another thing
finding
would
more
just be,
value.
hey, have seen you haven't placed an order in 3 months or 6 months. Is there something else going on? Like, have you been talking to another distributor? Is there a way that we can offer you some kind of, discount or one-time benefit for you that would sort of like bring you back around to looking at our stuff again? So I think it's more of, like you said, follow-up, or, kind of account maintenance, where salespeople can still bring a lot of value to the company while driving down sort of the barrier to entry of placing orders for people that they just want to do business with you. They don't require much upkeep. They're just a steady customer. They're placing orders with you at a steady rate. There's no need to sort of like interfere or get involved with that process, but there is still a need to sort of tend to the relationship and try to enhance it over time.
And I think that's a value add too. Like Amazon's probably not going to be able to do that very well for most
Right. We're
customers.
taking a lot of the busy work or tedium out of the sales process and letting it focus on additional value add and not placing orders. So
Exactly. So let's move on to some more of the technical stuff. So we want to talk about we've done a lot. One of the things I think me and you did early on is we realized how important the back office systems were for e-commerce and integrating into e-commerce with B2B, since we do obviously a lot of B2B, and we've done a lot of Magento and Shopify and
mhm.
BigCommerce that ends up being B2B related orders. And so there's a lot of these legacy back office systems. So and people always laugh when we say this, but we've actually done quite a few AS400 integrations because like some of these companies are just so tied to these really old systems that they
Yeah.
had to do it. We had to. There's no other way.
Yeah, well, I think it can be a training thing. You've invested so much time and effort into training existing fulfillment people and these operations folks, of which there tend to be quite a lot of in these B2B companies. So the sort of like human retraining costs can be very heavy. Also, there's just like a big data migration cost that kind of tie you into these legacy systems, where you've got all of these data records, and no other system directly parallels how the data is stored in your legacy system. So the cost of migrating all that data and like doing that sort of like cut over to go live, it can be a very expensive and risky and just time expensive as well, type of process. So for those reasons and a lot of others, these companies can get sort of tied into these like 20, 30, 40-year-old systems where, hey, if it works, like don't fix something that's not broken, right? That can be kind of the mindset
Yeah.
that gets into these companies. So yeah, one of the older systems that we still frequently encounter is AS400, which is an IBM based, like mainframe based system, where there's sort of like this big expensive computer that's housing all of your data and helping you do all of the logistical concerns of how much do we have in stock, where is the product in stock, what customers and orders are there for those products with that stock. So AS400 is one that we've worked with, which is based on sort of like this like legacy flat file system, where they've got a bunch of these files that are kind of it's very esoteric, where like these files have like these really complex specifications, and like a human can't really read it. It's just like all these like weird characters and stuff in the file. And so so that's like one legacy system we've worked with. Infor is another company that in the early 2000s came about. especially popular among distribution companies, just because their products tend to focus on sort of distribution and warehouse and complex pricing rules and complex warehouse order fulfillment rules. So they've really built their products to be compelling to those types of companies. So you got a lot of distributors using that.
Maybe they have a newer product, but a lot of people are still like they have the CSD product that we integrate with, but a lot of people aren't on the new, 11 version, so they're still on like the 10, 20-year-old version.
Yeah. So I'll talk about some of the things that are common between these like sort of legacy back office systems, but certainly integration has not been a focus, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. So another sort of set of products is like the Microsoft set of products. So Microsoft became, as I'm sure most people are aware, became very popular in the enterprise setting just because Windows took hold so strongly in the 90s and early 2000s with Windows 3.1 and Windows 95, et cetera. And then they had a server line of products, 2008 and so on. These Windows Server operating systems. So at the sort of enterprise company, which a lot of these B2B companies are, there's these vast sprawling companies. There's sort of like a very heavy tie-in to Microsoft as a company, just because, everyone's operating system is based on that. So you've got things like Microsoft Dynamics GP, Microsoft Dynamics Nav, and a lot of other, ERP systems that are based on Microsoft Windows Server. So one thing that to understand is that whenever you have these sort of enterprise software solutions, they want to sell you the entire set of stuff, right? So they want you to kind of think of like, okay, so I've got Windows, I've got Windows Server. Okay, what else does Microsoft have to solve this problem too, right? And that's what Microsoft wants you to do. They want you to kind of like look at their entire suite of software, and they want you to have like a one big contract that loops in all of those other pieces of software too. So sort of because of that, they don't want to focus on integration, right? They want you to sell, like, instead of integrating a solution with their software, they want you to buy the other software that already natively integrates with their stuff, right? So like because of that, so the anti-focus is of integration, right? They specifically historically haven't wanted integration to kind of be that much of a possibility. However, nowadays, sort of like they have to, right? Like because of the internet and because of how everything is on the internet and talking to each other, just the nature of the internet is interconnectivity. And so if you want to be on the internet, you have to focus on connectivity, right? So, and there's a lot of modern systems that have kind of overtaken some of these legacy products in the B2C space because of how easy it is to interconnect. Whereas with B2B companies, there's still so much to be gained by that all-in-one approach of enterprise software solutions that B2B has been a little bit slower to adapt. But now, in order to compete, you're basically having to kind of confront that reality. So that's another reason I think we're seeing sort of a big spike in focus from the B2B industry in these newer apps, is because they're trying to play a little bit of catch up.
Yeah. And I think the problem too is that then you have other legacy, like Oracle, I think has a couple legacy ones that we've done before. I mean, a lot of the big name ERPs all have these legacy platforms.
Yeah, there's so many we can talk about, but basically the landscape is very similar where, sort of like in the 90s, 2000s, there was a very heavy focus on these all-in-one solutions. And then like since round about like 2012, 2015, this type of time frame, the internet has become such a compelling way to sell that there's been this drive towards, getting everything online and this like focus on interconnectivity.
Yeah, and the problem is the modern e-commerce platforms like Shopify, BigCommerce, Magento, Insight's another B2B one that comes up. Almost all of them, with a few exceptions, are not the ERP systems. So now you have to, you probably, I think people stopped building custom e-commerce sites a while ago because of these platforms. It makes more sense to pick pick a platform and then build around that, because it saves you a lot of time.
Yeah.
And now
I think
you
as a business strategy, it's a lot easier to do one thing really, really well and get known for doing that one thing extremely well. Like I think, Shopify is a prime example of this, where they became so well known for how fast it was to set up a store for like a non-developer, just a random small merchant to set up a store. They became so well known for doing that one thing extremely well that the attention got brought there, and now a lot of people are using it, and now sort of like the afterthought or like the implication of this mass migration towards this app that does one thing really well is, well, how do we integrate all this other stuff with that? Because people wanting to use Shopify is kind of like a given now for retail, especially. So like now it's like, well, I've got this ERP system and we've got all these merchants using Shopify. To have good market share, I need to figure out how to integrate this with Shopify. So it's sort of like the stampede happens first and sort of like the fallout happens after, right? That's kind of the trend now of how the internet drives trends so fast and so furiously that interconnectivity has to be a focus, because people are adopting these things in a matter of months and years, not a matter of decades. Right?
Yeah. And that's where I think big B2B companies need to get smarter, is they need to start thinking about integration as their part of their strategy as their company, and how do I adopt new technologies and integrate with new technologies faster. Because if you're stuck on AS400 and it takes you years to add a new technology to integrate with it, you're probably not going to move very fast. You're probably going to lose market share. So let's move on, because I think we agree that a lot of the modern systems now have more interconnectivity, like a Salesforce or even the back office like a NetSuite or Salesforce, and Microsoft Dynamics now has 365. So they've all kind of like modernized. The problem is a lot of people aren't on those yet. They're still
right. Yeah. So these new systems, they're cloud-based, so they've got like the single point of failure addressed. They're integratable. They've got REST APIs or whatever to accommodate that.
Yeah.
But because they're so different, a lot of times the migration to the new version is very non-trivial. They've been completely rethought from the ground up. They've got completely different databases behind it. It's such a different beast that getting people onto these new solutions can be a chore and a half. So you still got a little bit of slow adoption from these B2B companies, and so we're still seeing the need to sort of back support some of these older systems that weren't really built in the first place to make integration friendly. So
it's funny. I think one of our guests a while back, he did a lot of ERP stuff. He actually was an ERP vendor in his original career, and then now he's more e-commerce. But I think he was saying that some huge percentage or a fairly significant percentage of people on SAP, when they try and do a certain upgrade, there's a certain version of it, they're so enterprise, they're so tied into this system that the upgrade is so painful that some of them literally go bankrupt trying to upgrade the system, because it's just so expensive. It's so costly to upgrade that it literally is just too painful. So I might be exaggerating there, but I think that's what he said.
I could see it being possible. Yeah, I mean, and I think it can be easy to underestimate how complicated that transition process can be, and how many different people get impacted by it, and the steps that need to be involved from multiple departments to make it happen. I think that can be sort of easy to take too lightly, and then you get it ends up sneaking up on you, the costs involved with it. So
yeah, I agree. That's why whenever someone tells me, hey, we're doing an ERP upgrade before our e-com platform, I'm
dun
always
dun
like,
dun.
yeah,
You get that feeling of dread in your stomach, right? Have you guys really considered what's going to happen here?
Yeah, or they always tell me, yeah, it'll be done in 2 weeks or a month or 3 months, and I'm like, yeah, call me back in 6 months or a year. You know what I mean? It always takes them way longer than they think.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
We need to do this first before, and I'm like, okay, well, don't waste my time, because it's going to take you long. So let's just there's kind of 5 approaches that we've taken at Trellis, which are pretty much the standard integration approaches that I think you can pretty much take. So, first one, if you just don't, if you're back, let's say you're AS400, you kind of have to go the flat file approach. So what would you do there when someone's on an old system?
Yeah, so this, the sort of the traditional approach to doing integrations where you had, these different mainframes, maybe they're sitting on a local network together. And so the different systems have, different ways of storing their data. And how do you move that data between the two systems? So the sort of original or very traditional approach is just flat file processing, where you have one server, it generates a file with a bunch of data on it. Then there's some way of getting that file onto the other server, usually using something like FTP, or some other method. The other server at some point, later on, goes, searches around, finds the file that was uploaded, extracts the data from that file, and then loads it into the other system. So you could see this with AS400 or a lot of older systems. This was sort of like, one of the main original approaches to handling this type of problem.
Yeah.
So you got some issues there, that can be a barrier to doing things faster or more optimally. So,
So what's the
one thing
problem?
is that,
Why don't you want to do that?
yeah, so why wouldn't you want to take the flat file approach? So one reason would be is that originally, back in the early days of the internet and local networks, FTP was not a encrypted system. So somebody who's on your local network maybe can sniff packets and take a look at the data that's being sent back and forth and capture that data, or just basically find things about your data that you maybe want to keep secure. So that's kind of like one traditional, I'm talking maybe 20 years ago, that was a concern there. Nowadays you've got alternative options to make that secure, like SFTP or FTPS, but that was kind of like one of the older issues. Another thing that you run into is that it requires batch processing, right? Because one server has to take a snapshot of the data at some point in time, stuff that into a file, then upload it, which has a delay. Then there's the other system eventually wakes up, right? Because it's on like some kind of cron job. At a regular interval, it's waking up to see if a file's there. So there's another delay. Then there's like the parsing of that file, another delay, and then there's the insertion, right? So there's significant delays to that process that maybe isn't tolerable in a
Yeah,
context of
it's
where you're
not
trying
good
to
for
move quickly.
real-time data. It's not good for you're not going to get real-time data.
Right.
And it sounds like it's also can be kind of an expensive process because you have to do this thing every hour or day, and you're not going to necessarily get the deltas as fast as you want of the data. So it sounds like
Exactly. So yeah, when you're trying to do like same day order processing, where someone's expecting their order to be delivered like 3 days from when they place the order, getting that order from the ordering system into the fulfillment system is a very time intensive process, right? You want to have that be as close to real time as possible. So that's a downside.
yeah,
Another issue potentially is the issue of single point of failure, right? So you've got or actually you've got like multiple single points of failure. You
that
got like,
doesn't sound good.
yeah, you've got like, if the one server goes down, then the batch files don't get created. So then you have to accommodate that for that in the other system, where, well, what if there's a gap of files, like they're not being uploaded? Does that mean something's failed, right? So you have to like make an alert system so that somebody notices that one of the servers went down. Then there's an issue where making sure that the delta still gets over, right? So if you have a couple of files that didn't get created, well, you can't just miss those files being uploaded. You have to at some point make sure that those files do end up getting created, even though the server was down for a period of time, right? So you have to have some kind of like rescue operation in the case of one of the servers being down, making sure that the delta still comes over, and sometimes that has to be in the right order, right? So you need to make sure the files are processed maybe in order, so that the translation of inventory doesn't happen in like reverse order and you get the wrong inventory being uploaded to the other system. There's a lot of failure points you have to accommodate for and then retroactively handle, right? So
Yeah. So it sounds like it's a pretty brittle slow, kind of like, it's just not the best, this is not the best way to do it, but sometimes you have to do it because they just don't have APIs. Obviously, they don't have GraphQL, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
there's more downsides to talk about, but you can see that there's a lot of potential issues here that you can run into.
this
So
is potentially a necessary, but also the worst way to do an integration in theory.
yeah, there's a lot better methods today for doing
Yeah.
things like this. So
So moving on to kind of the second oldest method, which happens time to time, is the SOAP XML or just SOAP API. And I think a lot of people get kind of, even myself, it can be confusing between SOAP and REST. So what can you explain what the SOAP API, these are kind of the original APIs that were built a long time ago, and obviously everything's moving to REST or GraphQL. So
yeah, so without getting super technical going into what this is about, but basically SOAP XML is a way of transmitting data. It's still in a text format, similar to like flat files, but instead of uploading a file to a server, instead you're transmitting this over HTTP, which is the protocol that
yeah,
the internet is based on, right? So it's basically making a request to a server by sending it a file over the HTTP or HTTPS protocols.
yeah,
So, XML is formatted in a similar way to HTML, which is the backbone of the internet. So what this is a tag-based system where you've got, angle brackets and then like text inside of angle brackets, and it opens and closes that. That's basically what a tag-based system is. There's an open tag and a closed tag. And SOAP is basically it's a format of sending that text in like a standard way based on XML. So, one issue with XML is it's very character dense. So you need a large number of characters to open and close those tags. So basically the size of an XML packet is rather large, relatively speaking, to some other formats.
yeah.
So like,
So it's a slightly more efficient way and real-time way of transferring and integrating data than the traditional flat file approach, but it's still kind of a heavy, expensive process because you're getting so much data in these things that you don't necessarily need all that data.
yeah, the data is usually the valuable piece of these integrations, and sort of the separators between the data is something that you don't want to be as expensive, because then you get very bloated data packets. So that's one downside of XML, is it's sort of very character dense. Another thing is that XML is a very sort of robust and strict format. So there's sort of data validation that goes on with XML, where you're comparing the data sent against this like schema, which is sort of like a template for the data you're expecting. And this schema that XML has is also very dense. It's very character dense, and it's also very hard for humans to read. It's so verbose that looking through an XML schema to maybe update it or just understand the format of the XML being sent is very taxing on like the human mind. So that's another issue with XML, is like the human upkeep of it is, comparatively speaking, kind of expensive. So and then one last thing is that SOAP has authentication. So, when you send the SOAP information, you want to make sure that the source sending it is authorized to send that data, right? You don't want some random computer out in the internet to send you data and interpret that as a valid request. So you need authentication, you need like username password system. And one issue with SOAP is that username password is usually coming over like as plain text passwords. So if someone was logging this XML on a server somewhere, if you don't do anything, the password will be stored in plain text, which is obviously not secure, right? So it's just another thing you have to accommodate for, is like plain text passwords. You'd have to probably replace it with like blank or stars or something before you save it as a log. Just another thing that's a downside that you have to consider.
Yeah. So obviously, I think a lot of people in the tech space are familiar with the concept of REST API, and that's kind of the more modern I'd say almost like right now, kind of the standard. Obviously, we'll get into GraphQL, but generally, GraphQL is a little bit newer. So it seems like most things are pretty much, doing REST API in terms of new applications. And that's obviously the ideal scenario for like, a modern, just like like a newer ERP system is probably going to be doing REST API, right?
Yeah, it's definitely the most common system used nowadays. Trellis is building an integration with Expertech, and Expertech's API it's all REST based. So it's been around for maybe 5 or 6 years in terms of heavy use. It's been around, and been spiking over the past several years. But some of the benefits, it's got some significant benefits over doing things with SOAP XML. And a lot of these have to do with the drawbacks I was mentioning as I was talking about XML. So one thing is just authentication. So there's very modern authentication protocols like OAuth, which was created by Twitter, which is basically a way of exchanging passwords in a secure way and granting temporary access to the API. So the idea is that instead of having a username and password that probably lives on for indefinitely, forever, until the access is revoked, instead with OAuth, you're granted a temporary access token that will expire. So this is a way of making sure that you're sending username and password infrequently, and when you do send it, you get temporary access to the API that will eventually expire. And then in order to refresh that access, you have to send like a different token. So it's sort of a complex handshaking experience, but the net benefits are that you have a secure way to authenticate with the API in a way where that access will eventually expire.
Yeah.
And then another thing about REST is that the format that you send the data in is much slimmer than XML. So in XML, where you'd have like open bracket username close bracket and then open bracket / username close bracket, like you'd have to put that around your data, whereas in JSON you have like curly braces, so it's just like one character to open and close an object, which is just way less expensive in terms of the size of your data packets that you're sending. So it's going to be
Way to pass data.
much more efficient and faster.
A simpler, kind of easier way to pass data than XML, and it's kind of a newer technology. And then now, kind of moving on, I think it's pretty clear the advantages of REST API. And then in a lot of ways, it's like almost like, I'm curious what you think about this analogy, but GraphQL to REST is kind of like what REST is to SOAP API, where it's like even another level of more efficient, integration.
Yeah. GraphQL has a lot of format similarities to REST API, in that the format's very similar to JSON, similar concepts. GraphQL tries to solve a couple of other issues or a couple of other problems that have come up when people are building REST APIs. So GraphQL is created by Facebook, and it's sort of like you can kind of see it as like a more modernized version of the REST API system, where one thing is, when you're querying data, sometimes you don't need all of the data in the response, right? So sometimes you'd want the response to be large because you want like all the data, and then other times you want to call the same endpoint and the response to be small because you're only interested in a very small subset of data.
Yeah.
So GraphQL allows you to specify when you make a query what data you want in the response, which is great. It allows you to make the response package much slimmer. And then another thing you often come across when you're doing REST APIs is you love to update a bunch of stuff at once. Like let's say user saves information about their name as well as their address, as well as their billing and shipping information, right?
Yeah.
So maybe you want to save all that at once. So rather than querying like 4 different REST endpoints to, okay, update customer, okay, update customer address, okay, update billing information, instead you do one single request with all of that information at once, and then the backend process updates that all at the same time and then sends you a single response back. So it's making sort of
call with GraphQL, just for someone that like doesn't understand the technical nuances, but to simplify, you can make one call to get 4 different pieces of data that normally with REST API, you'd have to make four calls.
Separate calls, yeah. So you can imagine the send and receive time on that is going to be much faster because you're only making a single request.
And potentially less code, less overhead. It's a simpler, thing to do. So,
Yeah, there's a lot. There's also other benefits, but I think we'll keep it simple here and just say that it's kind of an improvement on the REST API. That's kind of like the short version of
yeah.
why
And I
it's
think it's
useful.
really smart. It's funny because, like you said, some of these old systems didn't embrace integrations. But one of the smart things that I think the e-commerce platforms are doing specifically, like obviously we have the most knowledge around Magento, BigCommerce, and Shopify, because those are the ones that we do the most. All three of those platforms are aggressively trying to make GraphQL supported across every single endpoint and aspect of their data. So it's interesting to see how the e-commerce platforms realize how important this is, and they're working hard. And it seems like that's also a big improvement for headless, because you can get the data faster for if you go headless front end.
Yeah, absolutely. Headless. In a headless site, basically a lot of the heavy lifting is done by the client, right? It's done by the web browser. And so in order for all the data to come from all the different systems in an efficient manner, you want to be making as few API calls as possible to get all the data that you need. Because the latency and the waiting is going to be the least that way. So that's where GraphQL really does a lot of great work, is slimming down those responses and making the number of calls lower to get
Yeah,
what you need.
yeah, absolutely. And so one of the newer things that we've been doing a lot in the last couple of years is adopting iPaaS technology. So you have all these other things, and typically you might have to do some sort of custom app or build some sort of custom integration, and that can
Yeah.
get really expensive. You get into all this custom development, then you have to maintain that custom development. I think these integrations can get expensive. So there's been these new technologies called, iPaaS is integration platform as a service, and we actually
Hmm.
have Celigo on, who's one of our main iPaaS partners. So you could explain a little bit about iPaaS and when you think it became relevant, or obviously.
Yeah. So, in the past, let's say 15 minutes, we've been talking a lot about, so the idea of an integration is you have sort of the client side and the server side, right? That's the type of relationship you're supporting when you have APIs. You're allowing clients to grab stuff from a server. So we've been talking a lot about the client-facing technologies, but on the server side of things, how do you solution this? How do you create something to integrate with, right? So the traditional model here is you're throwing code on a server on the internet somewhere, right? So you're writing a bunch of code in a code editor that does stuff with data, maybe saves it in a database, um, provides that data to the external sources that need it. And this is all done by a developer, just writing a bunch of code. So there's sort of like the foundational code that is kind of like I would say the busy work of integrating, or is kind of like you can have scaffolding that shortens that process. But basically the idea is you've got a bunch of classes you need to write that are very similar each time, that are like interfacing with external systems, writing things to a database, selecting things out of that database with given conditions. And so, sort of when you talk about extract, transform, and load, which is what integrations often are, it's extracting data from one system, transforming that data into the format that the other system will understand it, and then loading that data into the other system. It's very heavy. The sort of the E, the T, and the L are all heavy in the traditional approach, where you have to write the code that will do the extraction, you have to write the code that does all the transformation, you have to write the code that does the loading. So that's sort of the traditional model. Another weakness, other than sort of the heavy time-intensive nature of doing all that work, is the fact that you've got sort of, again, single point of failure, right? So you've got like code that's sitting on exactly one system out there on the internet. If that exactly one system goes down, then you've got the entire bridge between the different things that need integration, that bridge entirely goes down, right? So that's another issue. So how does something like Celigo or an iPaaS solve some of these
Or Punch
problems?
Out to Go, our sponsor.
Or Punch Out to Go, our sponsor. Yeah, how, yeah, I got to mention them. So how does something like these iPaaS solutions solve this problem? Well, one thing is, if you've got two systems that commonly need integration, you want to be able to reuse that work, right? You want, if you're going to build an integration between NetSuite and Magento, if you've done that for one client as an agency, if you've done that for one client, you want to be able to reuse that work on another client and make that as maintainable as possible, right? So, you can have a common code base that you draw from every time you build one of these integrations, and that's a solution. But another great way to do that is to build an entire platform where these integrations are modules that you can just reuse across multiple accounts. So you build this integration robustly, feature-rich, and then you reuse that feature-rich integration between multiple projects. And that's something that something like Celigo facilitates, where you're able to, instead of building integration from scratch, you just say, okay, I've got like the NetSuite order integration module, and then I'll integrate that with the Magento order module, right? And so those two things can talk to each other very easily because you're reusing these modules. So that's one great thing. Another awesome thing about an iPaaS is that it makes the transformation, the T part, very easy, because across all these different integration touch points, they're all using one common format, which is JSON. So it's a format a lot of people are familiar with, and everything, no matter what system A and system B you're talking about, everything goes through this JSON transformation layer. And so the great thing about that is you've got all these different projects you've built on Celigo, but they all use this one very common interchange format, which is JSON. And developers, they learn that format once, and they instantly know how all the integrations work, or at least the transformation step of all these integrations. They can understand how that works without relearning anything across all those projects.
So to summarize, I think the value of an iPaaS, and you have, an e-commerce platform, you have an ERP platform, but now with all these integrations, especially when you have more than one major integration, you need a platform to manage your integrations, and that's where an iPaaS comes into play. And there's obviously other ones, I think, like Jitterbit, MuleSoft, of course, our
Yep.
sponsor comes out to go.
Yeah, we don't talk about those people though. We only talk about Celigo. But yeah, there's other solutions out there for this, is solving this type of problem. But yeah, there's so many benefits. I mean, there's a lot we haven't talked about, like error tracking, having like a common error interface to see what's going wrong with an integration if there is a problem. You can even live remediate an error by just basically editing the JSON blob that it tried to send, and fixing errors essentially like live without actually having to go into any code to manually retry an integration. You don't have to do that. You could basically just like edit it on the fly and retry that errored JSON blob again. So there's just like so many little things on top of the big things that we mentioned.
Yeah.
Also, you're avoiding single point of failure, right? Because Celigo, it's cloud-based, right? So if one of their servers in the cloud network were to go down, another server is there with the same Celigo code base on it that's going to spin up and take its place. So like, there's just so many things, multiple availability zones. I mean, I could go on, but there's a lot of benefits, and that's why we're seeing this sort of focus on iPaaS.
One last benefit I want to bring up, because I think specifically one of the reasons we partner with both Punch Out to Go and Celigo is they both also have some specializations in certain areas. So in some ways, you're almost not building from scratch. Like both of these iPaaS.
Yeah, you're harnessing a network of developers that have years of experience working with these platforms. So rather than Trellis needing to be an expert on NetSuite and an expert on SAP and an expert on Magento, which we are, an expert in so many of these different fields, instead you're reusing modules built by other developers that have those years of experience behind them. So it allows a company like us to work on a broader suite of technologies and be very effective and time efficient in doing so, because we have so much work that we can leverage from the community.
Yeah, so these iPaaS technologies typically have specializations in areas that they might focus on, because there's so many systems out there. That's the thing. You can't, it's hard
Yeah.
to do an
It's
expert.
impossible to be an expert on all of them. I mean,
Yeah.
even though we try, right? But it's it takes a long time, and it takes dedicated resources to doing so. And a mid-sized company like ourselves, it gives us a lot more flexibility in the types of clients we can work with, because we have that backing, that sort of robust framework that Celigo provides. So
Yeah. Cool. So, yeah, I mean, I think we covered a lot of details on integrations. I'm sure some people there's probably a lot for them to think about here. I usually like to leave
I'm
it
sure
like,
I lost. I'm sure I lost the majority of your viewers, and your B2B podcast is going to tank from here on out.
all that matters
So
is we got the right people that care about integrations on this. But well, I like to leave people with this: is like, what do you kind of think? Since we're talking about integrations, what do you see as kind of the future of integrations and B2B e-commerce from an integration standpoint? Obviously it's hard to predict way out, but what are you seeing? Do you think we'll see in the next few years?
yeah, I mean, we're already seeing a lot of interest in the types of solutions that we're focusing on, which are, sort of REST, GraphQL, iPaaS type solutions. We're seeing these companies where, they've done things in a certain way for 20, 30, 40 years that worked out pretty well for them. But they're seeing, especially with the current COVID situation, and just like the sort of attention and drive towards online, we're seeing the acceptance of the reality that it's time to innovate, it's time to overhaul, it's time to get things integrated and online and easier for people to use, no matter what type of company you are, no matter how big your individual accounts are, there is that need. And so I only see the current trends accelerating. I think people understand the need to compete with Amazon. I think people are understanding the need to facilitate millennials, which I hate labels like that, but it's people where the expectation is that every business has an online experience that's accessible and easy to understand, and usable on mobile devices. So
And I think that can apply to a lot more than people say millennials, or the new generation, but like, our partner at Expertech, Ken, Ken's definitely not a millennial, but he's pretty technically savvy, and I'm pretty sure that's what he's expecting when he goes through a user experience. So there are a lot of older people that are pretty savvy at this point with the internet.
yeah, I mean, you almost have to be, right? Like, if you weren't before, the trends are dictating that you'll want to be, right? So yeah, I think these types of trends will just continue to accelerate, and part of our job as an agency is to be ahead of that curve, right? To see what's coming and to be able to advocate to our clients why it's important. Because if we don't advocate for it now, it used to be you had maybe 5 years to catch up to a trend. Nowadays, it's more like you've got 2 or 3 years maybe to try to keep up with your competitors, because everyone's just evolving so quickly.
I
So
think if you wait 5 years, you're done. Like 2, 3 years, maybe even 1, 2 years, depending on the trend. You got to be faster about catching up on these trends. And
right. And so for somebody to complete a project 1 or 2 years out, we need to be advocating 3 or 6 months out, right? We need to be on top of these trends and being aware of the major players in the field and what their competitors are doing. That's the only way we can be a good technology advocate for our clients.
yeah, so you envision just a much more rapid acceleration of leveraging these newer integration technologies like GraphQL, REST, iPaaS, and
Yeah,
much
and
more of
the
it.
more complex the back office systems, the more complex the company and their fulfillment and distribution networks, the more complicated all of that is, the more value you gain from using something like an iPaaS solution. You're saving time both on the initial development and on the maintenance. You're facilitating a broader set of skills to be engaged with it, right? So if someone that's not even a developer can log into the back end of something like Celigo and have a root, sort of a base understanding of what's going on, being able to look at this integration stuff, and it's not an alien concept. I mean, the more people that you are allowing to engage with it and allowing to administrate it, right? So there's more and more value the more complex the business. So even more than like a retail company, I would say an iPaaS solution makes even more sense for some distribution
B2B,
company.
yeah, B2B,
B2B company, yeah.
Whether it's manufacturing or distribution, you have all these layers of things that need,
Yeah. Having a
selling.
one-stop shop, a hub basically that you can go to where all of your different integrations are managed from, there's just a bigger payoff for that the more and more different departments need to interact with it. So
Cool. Well, John, I want to thank you for your time. I hope I learned a lot. Honestly, a lot of the stuff I already knew, but there's things like even nuances that I think were helpful for me to kind of clarify, and sometimes even like relearning things is helpful. So I hope people learned a lot from this. And if you have questions, if you want to learn about integrations, reach out to John at Trellis.co. It's we can get you in touch with John.
yeah, technology is something that I'm fired up about. I always like to talk about it. So yeah, feel free to reach out. Yeah, I know it can be a little bit rambly sometimes, but I think we covered a lot of topics here, and there's a lot of content for people that I digest. So yeah, I think it was a good session. So
thank you. All right, thanks, John.
Absolutely. All right.